following morning started with nothing but a pounding headache for Lyra, while Bonbon was able to shake off the effects of the aftermath easily. It wasn't her first ordeal with an aftermath of drinking just a little too much alcohol, so she had grown used to hangovers. Despite her head feeling like it was going to explode, Lyra hadn't regretted the events of the previous night, especially the end activities. One thing was assured, after the final activity, she had slept like a newborn foal through the remainder of the night. Bonbon had kept her word and had tired her out, but that didn't mean she hadn't kept hers as well. The two mares had passed out in an embrace, both from their actions and the alcohol. Bonbon had awoken first, as usual, and before hopping out of the bed and proceeding to take a shower, had lightly kissed Lyra on the left cheek. The sound of the shower starting up was what had caused Lyra to stir, and almost immediately her head had begun to pound. As much as she didn't want to leave the comfort of the bed, she knew she had to, so she lifted the sheets from her body and scurried to the bathroom. Her steps were like the booming steps of a dragon or a giant, causing her head to ache. However, the steam that escaped the bathroom while opening the door helped to ease the thumping against her skull. The shower continued to run as Lyra gazed at herself in the mirror. Her mane was ruffled and sweaty, which caused her to startle a little, but she quickly stirred back to reality and just smiled at her reflection.
What a night.
She grabbed the provided brush in an aura of magic and ran the brush through her messy mane in an attempt to style it just a tiny bit. She planned to shower as well, but Lyra preferred not to deal with snags while shampooing her mane, so she always brushed her mane prior to washing. Luckily for her, the brush's bristles glided through her mane without snagging. However, in the process, something unusual caught Lyra's attention. In her head, she swore she had heard a mild whisper amongst the sound of the shower and the thumping against her skull. Lyra thought about asking Bonbon if she had said something or if she may have been whispering a track of Countess Coloratura's latest record, but then remembered she had drank too much wine.
Probably just a side effect from the hangover,
Lyra thought to herself, shrugging off whatever she may have heard. She finished brushing her mane, and quickly hopped into the shower with her beloved Bonbon. Not an uncommon action, seeing the two had been showering together even before marriage. The hot water eased Lyra's pounding headache as it ran over her body, along with a light kiss from Bonbon. Lyra smiled as Bonbon made conversation with her.
Rough morning?
You have no idea. My head feels like it's going to explode.
That's normal. Don't worry. I've got some remedies that will help with your headache.
I wouldn't doubt that.
Bonbon responded with her own giggle, leaning in for another kiss, which Lyra accepted and enjoyed in the mix of the heat of the shower and being in the presence of her beloved Bonbon. The kiss was released quickly as Bonbon nuzzled her head against Lyra's.
When you're finished, come back into the bedroom. Best cure for a hangover is rest.
Alright.
Bonbon accepted it and released, turning from Lyra and stepping out of the shower, leaving Lyra to her own thoughts. Lyra proceeded to grabbing the bottle of shampoo, not wanting to waste any more time than she needed to. Her head continued to pound as she squirted a small bit-sized glob of shampoo into her hoof, rubbed her hoofs together, and maneuvered it throughout her mane. The shampoo quickly turned to suds, as she did her best to wash out the sweat and whatever else may have been in her mane. While washing, Lyra once again caught something unusual. Just like before while brushing her mane, Lyra once again had heard something like a mild whisper in her head. Once again, Lyra just decided to shrug it aside as a side effect from the hangover, and continued to finish washing up her body. Once she finished up in the shower, Lyra returned to the bedroom as Bonbon had instructed. Bonbon was standing at Lyra's bedside with the bed sheets folded over nicely.
Just take it easy. Slow and steady steps.
Lyra followed her beloved's instructions, taking easy steps towards her side of the bed. Her headache had fallen to a much more milder level of pain from the steam of the shower. Therefore, her steps no longer felt like thumps against her frontal lobe. Slowly and steadily, she made her way to Bonbon and positioned her body into a comfortable position on the bed. Bonbon assisted, placing the sheets over Lyra's body gently. Bonbon followed up, placing a glass of cold water on the surface of Lyra's nightstand.
Get some rest, and in between rest breaks, I want you to drink some water slowly. If you need anything, just yell for me. Don't get up.
All right, Mom.
Lyra joked, causing Bonbon to giggle and roll her eyes.
And no more jokes. Rest and water. Got it?
Got it.
Lyra replied sweetly, as Bonbon turned away and walked out of the room, closing the door behind her. At the sound of the door closing, Lyra followed Bonbon's instructions, taking a small sip of water. She swallowed the cold liquid down her throat, then closed her eyes into a slumber. Lyra opened her eyes, only to find herself in the bed, her limbs aching and her head feeling like small bombs were going off inside of her skull. Bonbon was there with her, snoozing like a foal, and a smile spread across her face. Bonbon's mane was a sweaty mess, looking as if her mane had been ruffled by some pony. Lyra just smiled, listening to Bonbon's sweet and shallow breaths. Lyra attempted to lean inward for a kiss, but found her body unable to budge from its current position. Lyra attempted to move, but it was as if her body was full of lead. She couldn't move a muscle, causing her to immediately panic in desperation, beginning to overhear something she swore she recognized. A shallow whisper muttering something she couldn't make out. That was when her body began to move, but not by her own force. Her body had moved on top of Bonbon's body in a dominant mount. It felt like she was watching a movie, only instead of the movie being on a screen, it was from her line of sight. She thought she was just going to awake Bonbon by booping her nose, but things took an immediate dark turn when she saw her hoofs reach out towards one of her spare pillows, gripping it and moving it over towards Bonbon's head. Lyra felt a tear escape her eye as she screamed for Bonbon to wake up, only for her screams to be unheard. The climax came as Lyra watched in terror and shock, her hoofs gripping the pillow, flail down violently over Bonbon's head. Bonbon didn't move at first, only continued to sleep, until her inability to breathe finally came to attention and Bonbon began to struggle and flail her hoofs in desperation. Bonbon's screams of desperation only came out as mutters of fear, sadness, and pure desperation. As a result, the pillow was just pressed down even harder on Bonbon's head. Lyra just screamed screams of silence and terror, watching the horror unfold. She just cried desperately, unable to escape from the scene. After much longer than it would normally take for a pony to suffocate, Bonbon finally began to succumb to the suffocation. Lyra just wanted to close her eyes and escape this Tartarus she had entered, watching as her beloved fell limp. Just when she thought the worst had passed, the pillow was lifted, revealing a pale Bonbon. However, with a sudden inhalation of air, it was made clear that Bonbon had been spared, but only had a small shred of life left in her. The events of the scene took a grim turn once again, with Lyra remaining on top of Bonbon, raising her hooves into the air. Lyra, already broken, had no choice but to watch as her other body came down with her hooves, straight into the face of Bonbon. The horrid image of blood splattering into her sight became visible, along with Bonbon having a horribly broken muzzle. Blood seeped from her nostrils as yet another hammer fist landed into Bonbon's face, causing more blood to obscure her vision. It was at this point that Lyra had reached the urge to vomit, watching the horror continue. Another hammer fist hit, then another, and another. Blood splatter covered the walls, the bed was soaked with crimson, and Lyra's vision had become nothing but a crimson-red filter. The worst part of it all, though, was that Bonbon was still alive by a tiny shred. Lyra prayed that this horror show was over, but it became obvious it wasn't when the events continued to worsen. The unknown Lyra had begun to drag Bonbon's near-lifeless body out of the bed, down the stairs, and into the kitchen. Lyra immediately shuddered, knowing where this was going. noticing the sink full of water. Her fears came true as she watched her other body dunk the head of Bonbon into the water. She cried for mercy, wanting this horror show to end, but it didn't end. It only continued to devastate and tear Lyra apart. Every time Bonbon would be close to drowning, this monstrous version of Lyra would immediately pull her head from the now crimson water. This action repeated multiple times, until finally, Bonbon was left in the water to drown for good. Lyra sobbed massively, watching as the demented version of herself made its way back up the stairs and into the bathroom. It stood before the mirror, reflecting a blood-soaked version of herself in dread and unconditional terror. Lyra continued to hold back the urge to vomit. She didn't know what to believe. All she knew was that she couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. She had killed her beloved in a very brutal and malevolent manner. In the mix of terror, confusion, and loss, she overheard the same mild whisper once again. What followed was completely unexpected. The other Lyra smashed their head into the bathroom mirror, causing shards of glass to fly everywhere. The impact had caused the mirror to fall to the bathroom floor, but the strange thing about the ordeal was that Lyra had actually felt the impact, yet she wasn't bleeding like the other pony. The final set of the horrid sequence of events ended with the other Lyra gripping a glass shard and impaling the shard into her throat and slashing it violently throughout the entire perimeter of her small throat. Lyra felt the pain sting her entire throat, but nothing happened to her, while her other self convulsed on the floor and gagged, a massive pool of blood being formed around her. It all ended with the perspective fading to pitch black, and before screaming in desperation of escaping this Tartarus, heard the same mild whisper reverberate throughout wherever she may have been. The whisper spoke something that she couldn't make out, as she screamed in desperation.
Lyra? Lyra!
Bonbon yelled in consideration, having been alerted by a blood-curdling scream from downstairs. Lyra finally stirred awake, breathing rapidly in fear. Her body was drenched in a cold sweat, and her heart was racing at a rate that would be considered nearly fatal. Lyra struggled to come back to reality, as Bonbon did her best to comfort her beloved. Lyra caught sight of her beloved Bonbon, and quickly pulled her into an embrace. Bonbon accepted, and rubbed her hoof along Lyra's back.
I'm sorry.
Shh, shh, shh. You don't need to be sorry, Lyra. What in Celestia happened?
Lyra attempted to explain what had caused her to fall to a state of despair and pure terror, but just as she was about to speak, all of the events that had occurred had escaped her. She tried to remember, but it was all just a giant blank, and Lyra couldn't explain why she couldn't remember something so traumatizing. Baffled and unable to process anything, Lyra just responded with the only answer she could give in that moment.
I don't remember.
Lyra replied, continuing to hold Bonbon close, not wanting to ever let her go. Bonbon followed, unsure of what to think about the situation.
I'm here as long as you need me to be.
Bonbon said calmly, continuing to hold Lyra. The embrace went on for an hour, before Lyra even dared to try going back to sleep. When she did, Bonbon stayed. She refused to leave her beloved's side. Two days passed, and Lyra's condition had only seemed to worsen. The nightmares had grown more haunting, almost seeming realistic in nature. The torture methods had become more violent and grotesque, causing Lyra to jolt awake with an urge to vomit each time. As an attempt to help the sleep-deprived unicorn get some much-needed rest, Bonbon had given Lyra some medication that helped ponies sleep, but it had not been effective in the slightest. Lyra's nightmares continued, and each time Bonbon would question her on the contents of the nightmare, Lyra's thoughts would immediately go blank. It made no sense, as most traumatizing nightmares were normally burned into the victim's memories. Bonbon knew that all too well. She had had her own fair share of terrifying nightmares. However, the most she had ever experienced after she had awoken was a cold sweat, heavy breathing, and an increase in her heart rate. Never had she awoken screaming so loud that it sounded like she was being murdered or tortured, nor with the urge to vomit or sweating so badly that it had left a spot in the sheets. She had become concerned for her beloved Lyra, afraid that one of these times she would not wake up. Medication had not helped, nor a warm and relaxing bath with a massage afterwards. Bonbon had run out of options and had scheduled Lyra for a doctor's appointment, hoping that a reason for these sudden nightmares could be found. In the 2 days of no sleep, Lyra had become paranoid as well, afraid to even be near or around Bonbon. Even Bonbon had seen a change in Lyra's approach, seeing anytime she attempted to kiss, hug, or even get close to Lyra, Lyra would immediately turn away. It hurt Lyra the most, but something told her that she needed to remain distant. Otherwise, her nightmares could become a reality. Another sign that told her to stay away was the fact that what started out as a side effect from her hangover had become a constant presence in her mind. She feared she might have been going crazy, but in her mind, she wanted to believe it was just some sort of sickness she had caught. But that still didn't explain why what had started as a whisper had become more audible, and that it increased any time she got near Bonbon. Why was this happening? Lyra wondered. And more importantly, was it too late? She prayed to Celestia that this doctor could find the cause of this whole ordeal. She just wanted things to go back to normal, for her to be able to live a happy life with her beloved Bonbon, for the terrifying and haunting nightmares to end, for that damn reoccurring voice in her head to be silenced. That was all she could do. Pray and hope, as she made her way through the double glass doors of the Ponyville Hospital. The waiting room was packed with ponies of all ages, which was not uncommon at all. Luckily for Lyra, she didn't have to wait long, mainly 10 minutes after doing all the paperwork. It turned out most of the waiting room was just inpatients already administered in the hospital, doing their daily exercise to avoid getting blood clots in their forelegs. Lyra was called back quickly, being led by a nurse she was familiar with, Nurse Redheart, one of the hospital's kindest yet strict nurses on staff. She was led to a smaller room after being weighed and given the usual vitals examination. With a few words and a reassuring smile, Lyra was left alone, fidgeting with her hooves while examining the interior of the room and a chart describing and labeling the anatomy of a pony's body. Between her fidgeting and examining, that reoccurring voice in her head made itself known. She couldn't make out what was being said, only that it was more mild than usual. Lyra didn't make any movements, nor did she state anything toward the voice, thinking it was just her mind playing tricks on her. She only continued to fidget and examine the chart, waiting for the doctor to arrive. It was about another 5 minutes before the sliding door to the room slid open, entering a brown-coated stallion with a chocolate-brown mane and blue eyes. On his name tag was the name Dr. Bronston, which Lyra quickly recognized as the former Canterlot Morgue medical examiner. He had decided to return to simple medical practice after an occurrence in the morgue he found bizarre. Lyra remembered reading the story in the newspaper, and even found it bizarre herself.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Heartstrings.
Good afternoon, Doctor.
So, what seems to be the problem?
He asked with concern, grabbing a spare notebook and pencil.
I'm not sure. In the last 2 days, I've been restless due to nightmares that I've been having. I wake up screaming, sweating to death, and my heart rate is at a rate that most doctors would consider in the range of near fatal.
I see. Don't take this personally. It's just part of my job. But prior to having these nightmares, did you partake in any drug activity?
What? No. All I had was 2 glasses of wine.
Alright, Mrs. Heartstrings. I'm only asking because it says I have to, okay?
Right. I'm sorry, Doc.
Lyra apologized, confused on why she had reacted so angrily.
Apology accepted. Now, you said you had wine prior. You are aware alcoholic beverages can cause nightmares, right?
Yes, I am. However, that was 2 days ago, and the beverage has since then made its way out of my system.
Mrs. Heartstrings, I'm going to have to ask you to calm down, or I will have you escorted out of the building.
Lyra paused, taking a second to calm down. She had once again snapped unintentionally and didn't know why. It could have been due to lack of sleep, but normally she was conscious of her actions. She just gave her best answer.
Sorry, Doc. I haven't been able to sleep for 2 days, so I snap easily.
Understood. Just understand I'm just doing what I'm told to do.
Right. Carry on. I'll do my best to answer.
Good. Bronston finalized, continuing to follow asking the questions on the sheet he gripped. Lyra explained how the details of the nightmares escaped her mind whenever she tried to explain what had occurred, along with the voice in her head that proposed gibberish she couldn't understand. Both of those claims made Bronston raise an eyebrow in consideration, unsure of whether Lyra was telling the truth, or if deprivation of sleep was causing her to say things that were complete nonsense. That wasn't his job, though. His job was to find a solution.
Alright, Mrs. Heartstrings. I'm going to order you a stress test. After that, I'm having some blood work ordered, an MRI, and a mental and physical test done as well.
Lyra wasn't too satisfied with all the unnecessary tests being proposed by Bronston, but at this point, she felt like she had no choice but to follow the doctor's orders. She nodded her head in agreement as Bronston finished writing down some things on his notebook. Once he finished, settling the pencil between his right ear and skull, he turned to Lyra with a smile.
Don't worry, Mrs. Heartstrings. We will get you better.
I hope you are right.
Many hours passed of endless testing, and after what seemed like forever, Lyra sat and waited for the results. She hadn't been cured, seeing the voice still remained, speaking the same gibberish. As the clock ticked, she attempted to make sense of what the voice was saying, but it was too muffled and distorted to even hear clearly or fluently. All it was causing her was a headache, so she rubbed her temples to try and soothe the aching. Once again, it wasn't effective at all, and seemed to only antagonize the voice even more. The sound of the door sliding open startled the mare out of her trance of concentration, feeling her nerves settle and her headache subside as Bronston took a seat, setting a large stack of papers and documents onto the tabletop. Lyra sat in suspense, hoping that somewhere in that large stack of papers was the answer to what in Celestia was going on with her body's state.
Anything, Doc?
I'm afraid not, Mrs. Heartstrings. I've checked your results, and everything seems normal. Your temperature is a safe 98.3 degrees, all of your vitals are healthy, and your mental state is as normal as it normally seems to be. I'm sorry I couldn't help you find anything, Mrs. Heartstrings. I've literally done all I can to help, and in the end, I believe your answer doesn't lie in the medical field, which is why I'm going to recommend you seeing a psychiatrist for your current predicament. Unexpected terrifying nightmares and a voice in your head seems more like a psychological issue than a medical issue. I truly am sorry, but that's all I can do.
Lyra sat speechless. She had come here hoping for an answer to whatever may be wrong with her, but here she was back at square one, with no clue on what to do except follow Bronston's advice. In some matter, she felt betrayed and angry, like there was more Bronston could do. He was just too busy waiting for his paycheck to want to help her solve the mystery behind her situation. With those thoughts, something happened that Lyra did not expect. That same chilling voice reverberated in her skull, but this time it was different. The gibberish she had heard before was now clear as day. The reverberating voice muffled out anything Bronston may have said, as Lyra listened, hearing what seemed like a mixture of whispering and some sort of conflict. She didn't know what to do, feeling some invisible force tell her to ignore the whispering and get out of there. She felt a sudden strong urge overcome her body the more she listened to the voices in her head. The urge felt like a pure hatred, as Lyra felt her sanity start to fall to a comatose state, and her personality had begun to change to a more malevolent mindset. She eyed the Doctor with daggers of rage and persistence, noticing Bronston's pencil settled on the desktop. The volume of the voices increased, and even in a comatose state, Lyra could make out the dialogue of the voices now. The dialogue made her shudder and immediately sent her into a panic. The voices were telling her to kill Bronston, that he had promised her that he would help her, He would make her better. He would cure her. He had lied, and instead did nothing but earn a paycheck. That's all doctors are good for. That's all they do. Take money and leave ponies to suffer in pain. He should be punished for his lies, for his betrayal. It seemed like she was listening to a record being played in reverse like she had done in her teens. It made her feel uneasy, yet it also made her feel powerful in some way. She wanted to punish him, because the voices were telling her the truth. She wanted to take that pencil and shove it through his neck, forbidding him from ever speaking a lie ever again in his pathetic life. It took her a minute to realize that while in her comatose state, she had been reaching outward for the pencil, and while she was still sane, took her opportunity to leave. She darted out of the room like a rocket, and despite Bronston objecting and trying to call Lyra back, she never turned back. As she trotted like a mad horse, she thought to herself on how she could ever even have such sinister thoughts. The voices in her head yelled for her to turn back and give Bronston his punishment, but Lyra refused, and ran non-stop until she was out of the hospital and beyond. After succumbing to exhaustion, Lyra took a seat on the ground. She had ended up just outside of Ponyville, and now sat with fear, confusion, and dread on what had just occurred in the hospital. If she had not come back to reality any second sooner, Bronston would have been bleeding to death from a pencil being impaled into his neck. Lyra shivered, not sure what to do or think. All she could think was, what if that had been Bonbon, and instead of a pencil, the weapon had been one of the knives she used to cut the vegetables. A tear escaped her eye at that thought, unsure of what to do now. She took deep breaths, small bits of sweat dripping from her muzzle, as she attempted to even find a solution to what had just happened. She had just nearly killed some pony, and had no control over her actions as it happened. Fear was all she could feel. She had never had the urge to harm another pony, nor the urge to kill, so what in Equestria had caused this? And more importantly, could she stop it? Lyra thought back to what Dr. Bronston had suggested. A psychiatrist. She didn't dare take another chance of possibly killing some pony. That was when it hit her like a ton of bricks. Did she dare return home? She would be endangering her beloved Bonbon, but where else could she go?
Where can I go? What can I do? Am I going fucking crazy? How can I stop this? Easy, Lyra. You can't be afraid of this. You're stronger than some voice in your head speaking pure gibberish. You need to quit worrying so much about this voice. It's only something caused by sleep deprivation? I think that's what Bonbon called it anyway. Whatever. I just need to concentrate. I control me. Not a damn voice. It's all in your head, Lyra. Nothing more.
With every bit of confidence the mare could muster, she stood back up and made her way back to her home, attempting to hold a smile as she walked. That smile never came. Only a sense of fear. The sound of vegetables being chopped up was all Lyra heard, as she closed the door to the house and steadily made her way into the home. Bonbon became aware of Lyra's presence, as she turned from her half-chopped-up vegetables to her beloved in a very unstable condition. She kept her distance, attempting to mutter out anything.
So, what did the doctor say?
Nothing I didn't already know.
Out of the stillness of the silence of the house and Bonbon's unsure expression, the whispers came once again. But this time, the message was said in a violent and demonic tone that made Lyra's hooves nearly collapse.
Punish her. She punished you. Now take your revenge. She's a slut. A whore who cheats me out of back with her cashier. She lies. She doesn't love you. She uses her for her pleasure. She doesn't deserve life because she wrongs others. Destroy her.
Shut up. She would never hurt me. You're lying.
Lyra yelled in anger, not aware that she was yelling at blank space in Bonbon's eyes.
You're a useless idiot in her eyes. She pretends she likes it, but in her eyes, you are nothing but a waste.
No, you're lying. You're lying.
She didn't want to believe the voice, but in ways, she did want to believe it. Why had Bonbon chosen to stay with her, let alone marry her? She was a mare who couldn't even brush her maid without messing up or causing an even bigger mess. Had Bonbon really only used her for pleasure and nothing more? Was she really cheating on her with Sunflower Spring? Sunflower was very supportive, had asked Bonbon to save her a glass, and even winked at her when they left that day. Could it be true? The voice continued to antagonize her as these thoughts ran through her head.
She's a user. You should see her when she's with that bitch, Sunflower Spring. She's all over her, touching her and kissing her every...
Lyra!
The voice was interrupted by Bonbon, standing with a look of worry and confusion. Lyra came to her senses, not aware of what she had just said. Lyra made eye contact, confused yet slightly angry. That same feeling of hatred had returned, as Lyra finally spoke, a look of anger expressed on her face.
Do you?
What?
Do you use me? Am I just your free card for pleasure?
Lyra, what are you talking about? I've never used you for pleasure. Even Mary chose to love for the rest of my life. When we have our moments behind closed doors, it's for the reasons I married you and nothing else. Why are you thinking I use you?
Bonbon asked, getting into a defensive stance, just in case she had to do any drastic actions. Lyra felt sincerity in those words, but the voice was telling her otherwise. Lyra attempted to shake her head free of the voice, but it only made it worse.
Allow me to show you that she's a dirty bear that uses you.
Lyra tried to ignore the voice antagonizing her thoughts, but it was quickly interrupted by a set of imagery, as Lyra felt her body enter that comatose state once again. All she could see was an image of Bonbon kissing and intimately touching Sunflower Spring. At first, she didn't even think twice that this was real, but as the imagery went longer, Lyra became conflicted. Seeing the imagery seemed real. Then it only grew more real, as the imagery faded back to reality, where Lyra could hear Bonbon speaking to her. But next to her was Sunflower Spring, with a look of seductiveness all over her face. Lyra blinked twice to make sure she wasn't just seeing things, but Sunflower was there both times, French kissing and caressing her tongue along Bonbon's neck. Tears filled Lyra's eyes as she watched Sunflower Spring continue her dirty deeds, saying something in the process.
Move aside, you dumb bitch. She's mine. She's always been mine.
That made Lyra's anger rise as she leaked tears and yelled out in fury.
Get off of her, you dirty slut!
Lyra commanded, lunging forward only to hit nothing but air. At least, that's what Bonbon saw. She watched as Lyra continued to fight an invisible force that she couldn't see. She wasn't sure what to do, afraid that if she approached Lyra, she might put herself in danger. She didn't want to hurt Lyra unless she had to, and kept her defensive posture as she neared Lyra, growling in frustration at the kitchen wall.
Lyra!
Lyra ignored her, continuing to yell at the wall. She had no choice but to get Lyra's attention by pulling her attention from the wall, or whatever she was yelling at. Bonbon reached out her hoof and tapped Lyra's shoulder. The second the contact was made, Lyra stopped yelling, and instead, turned slowly where she was eye to eye with Bonbon. Bonbon felt uncomfortable, looking at the yellow bloodshot set of eyes staring at her, full of tears and pure anger.
And you broke the promise mess you made to me.
Lyra yelled, lunging violently out at Bonbon. Bonbon managed to dodge Lyra just in time, watching as Lyra went flailing into the wall on the other side of the kitchen. Lyra wasn't giving up that easily, turning toward Bonbon once again, sliding a large knife out of its slot in the knife set holder.
Lyra, what are you talking about?
Don't play dumb, you unfaithful slut. You never loved me. It was always that cashier, Sunflower. You just stood there while she kissed your neck. What kind of man were you to just stand there while my heart was ripped in half?
Lyra, Sunflower isn't here. I've never slept with her. We're just friends. Nothing more. I love you and only you. Please put the knife down. And let me help you.
You want to help me? Then join your little whore friend in Tartarus.
Lyra ran forward with the aim to pin Bonbon against the wall, and was not stopping. Bonbon abandoned all attempts to talk sense into Lyra, and resorted to defending herself. Bonbon caught the knife, feeling it cut into her flesh a tiny bit, but nothing hurt worse than the pain she felt in her heart. Lyra pushed forward hard, but Bonbon had the upper hoof, kicking the blade out of Lyra's grasp onto the floor. Lyra attempted one more lunge, but was stopped by a kick to her liver, immediately causing her to lose her breath. Before she could recover, Bonbon finished the assault with a spinning kick to Lyra's left temporal lobe, knocking her out instantly. Bonbon sobbed as she watched Lyra fall to the floor unconscious. She wanted to vomit, but instead proceeded to getting Lyra to a controlled environment.